Panel, when people feel like you are not representative of them, but you are representative of an international body that they have no buy-in into, that they have no say over, and that they don't feel is actually trying to solve the issues that they care about, that is when you stop the left advancing in countries that can actually really benefit from the kinds of policies the left brings them. I'm going to do a couple of things. First of all, frame what we think the rise looks like, what we think the counterfactual looks like, and then I'm going to go into why we think that this harms leftist advancement and policies within areas that benefit from them. What do we think the rise looks like? I think it looks like increased ties and engagements, where you rely on these people for supporting the funding of those parties, specifically in relation to things like campaign funding, right? Where you are the individual leader of a party and you want to have more money to spend on media campaigning, but then they tie that to the kinds of things like the policies that you're willing to run on, the stances that you're willing to have in things like televised debates, the people that you're willing to talk to and engage with. I think oftentimes it's then uniquely tied to the most wealthy countries, right? Because if the most leverage that you have over a party is to say, we will fund your campaign if you're willing to make these campaign promises, that is going to be so much more tied to the countries that can offer and the donors that can offer the most money. So it looks like the US or the global West in general, because they just generally have the most advanced economies they can then use to give the most, offer the most funding, and therefore get the most promises out of those people. I think that means you get control over, but I also think that like just in communication in general as well, right? In terms of what they should do, why they should do it, whatever, is going to be influenced by the people that are seen to have the most powerful economies, because they are the ones that are seen to have been the most successful or be good at advancing those policies. Why then does that give these people large control over that policy? One, by establishing direct conditions to it, i.e. we will tie funding to you making these promises, or just generally misleading politicians of your own country, right? Like if we're looking at countries where you have weaker left-wing parties who are trying to advance their footholds in those areas, who don't have who maybe are a new party, who don't have lots of experience in government, then you probably can mislead them or give them information that is uniquely applicable to the context of your own country. They then maybe make bad decisions based off of and then run policies they shouldn't. And the counterfactual here is that politicians stay local, are forced to engage with their localities for things like funding, but also engagement and discussions of what policies they should run, and that necessarily makes them more tailored to those areas. I think there is still funding insofar as these countries still have economies, and there are still things, generally established democratic norms, right, of like campaign funding and things like that. And so then you still are able to get these left-wing parties like having a level of operation that allows them to do things like run for office and whatever. I would note that I think that the counterfactual or the comparative of this debate does not take place in rich countries where they already have a dominance of money, where they already have a dominance of political capital, and where they already have very well established links and discussions of what policies they should advance, given that they are the most developed and have had the most time to develop. Why then does this harm left-wing policies and parties? One, backlash. Firstly, because these policies are oftentimes seen as radical. Because when you are a country that has more typically right-wing norms, like more conservative norms, because societies default towards conservatism, given that's just the preservation of the ways that things were, and therefore when societies develop and they keep those things, that is by necessity conservatism, right? I think that means that those policies that are now not tied to the countries that those left-wing parties are operating in, but rather are seen as policies that were only applicable once you had reached a certain stage of development, were able to advance on certain policies, like for example the overture, like for example Roe v. Wade or gay marriage or whatever. I think that means that those policies are seen as a much bigger shift to the Overton window, or a much bigger shift away from the norms of what voters in those areas are used to. And so then you probably have much more backlash to the point where you think they are trying to actively shake the fabric of society as opposed to just alter it a little bit, which is what happens when they are applied in the countries those original policies come from. Secondly, you see it as international intervention. So at the point where you see, for example, the US or big superpowers as bad actors in the way that they've intervened in other countries' politics through like trying to influence elections or things like that, then at that point where you see those parties trying to sway the votes and sway the policies away from things that you don't like, or that you feel are going to meddle with the mechanism of society as you understand it, you are more likely to be hostile towards those forces and stir up more aggression against that. Thirdly, you fear the progression of those policies. So even if those policies aren't initially harmful, at the point where you feel like those policies aren't coming from the people that are actually within that country, but rather America or the UK or people that you don't like or you don't trust, then it means you're able to stir up fear not of the policy itself, but of the fear of the progression of that policy, that it could get worse for you. It could take away more of the things you care about, deny more of your freedoms, what have you. I think that gets sensationalized further, and that means you further the backlash against the left from people that don't maybe initially agree with them. That means you get less votes in favor of them, but also an uptick of narratives against those people. You get less cooperation with left-wing parties that are operating in those areas from other parties who are maybe more on the center or more on the right, who would be willing to cooperate with them otherwise, where they are more trusting of them, but now fear that cooperation could lead to the further denial of things that they care about. But also it's the most hateful or emboldened. And I want to be very clear here. When we are dealing with things like far-right nationalists or just far-right people in general who do think that gay people don't deserve rights, who do think that women should be attacked if they try and leave their husbands, then the further emboldenment of those people does lead to more harm to those communities, both politically and physically, at the point where they think that there is now a force that is trying to commit some kind of culture war against them by intervening in affairs From outside of this, when the comparative is that you are more isolated, you are more known, you have more moderate policy because you aren't likely to be influenced by these things, and at that point, you probably don't have the same kind of backlash at the point where the party is seen as being more local, not seen as having as radical policy, and whatever else. Before I go on closing.
Yeah, so do you think George Soros walks in a room, puts the money on the table, and says you have to be completely for
that is like literally how so much of politics works. Like at the point where you think that at the point where you can fund your own campaign, where you think more people will see your face and remember you in the voting booth, you do take that money if you don't think that it's actually going to harm your chances as much. Then you lose support within the left. One, from your own politicians because of splintering. Note if we're dealing with countries that maybe you do have more moderate left people within that, then when they see those policies similar to my further analysis being more radical or more of a shift, then you do get variations and splintering of the party, which weakens its chances in elections, because oftentimes people do vote based to some degree on name recognition or on how local the person is or how much they feel like they're a nice guy or whatever. And when you lose the people that could potentially play on those terms because they are people that were previously tied to you, you worsen your election chances. But secondly, supporters, because even when you're running policies they agree to, but we think that you won't always, they don't feel as listened to. So when you're passing things like labor laws, for example, trade union leaders don't feel like you've actually consulted them in engaging in those things. And when they feel like there is no party or you are not going to represent them, they are more likely to opt out of those things. So on net, you just get less buy-in. Why do they make bad decisions on policy? One, because of a lack of information, because they don't know what policies are going to be effective. It's quite difficult to determine all of the policy outcomes, and so you can make bad decisions when you're influenced by things like money, because you see these things to have worked elsewhere, even if the contexts are different. So you make bad decisions, even if, not like knowingly, when you just think that you're taking money to further your campaign, and those things are directly tied to funding. I think that you weaken left-wing policy, you get more backlash, more right-wing emboldenment, but you also lose left-wing policy like welfare, like the enactment of social rights, which we say are unequivocally good things, because they allow for people to be uplifted out of poverty, because they allow for the furthering of an economy, because social rights allow for people to live as they are and be comfortable in their identity. You implement hate crime laws so they can't be attacked in the streets. I think those are all things that the left uniquely campaigns for. The counterfactual is local policy that is more tailored, more palatable, that people feel listens to them more. That you don't need funding for these things, you just need to convince people, and you convince them more when the policy is palatable. We get all of that, we prevent all of the backlash. So proud to propose.
Ask you to express, if you do not wish to be recorded, that you express this as the beginning of your speech. You can withdraw later if you figure it out later. That being said, I would like to invite the leader of the opposition to continue this debate. You're here.
If I sit down in the middle of the speech, I apologize. It is because of breath issues. I hope it doesn't happen. Okay. I'm going to talk about three things. First, responses to OG. Second, I'm going to talk about how we have actually seen this happen and what are the characteristics of when a globalist left rises. And we think that it is much more incidental than OG seems to believe and much less institutional. And then I'm going to talk about why we think that the ability to coordinate is the thing that crosses the threshold in order to achieve many of the changes that they want to talk about, which otherwise is impossible. So the first thing I want to talk about is OG's argument of the West takes over and then the local leftists are forced into being really extreme and being pro-Roe v. Wade. So I think there are a few responses here. First of all, I don't understand if OG thinks this debate is happening in Iran. Like most countries that are affected by the globalist left that can organize a protest that's inspired by Greta's post are not those kinds of societies where association with the left is immediately a curse or a stain upon your reputation. In fact, in many countries that this debate is about, I don't know, India, Mexico, Turkey, that are open enough in order to connect to international channels, in those countries, oftentimes association with the West is a positive marker on your association or on your organization, one that the government trusts more, or one that the government is at least more scared to take actions against the second that it is enveloped in a Western organization institutionally. The second response is just the fact that they assume that this that this is, even if there are many oppositional forces, they only start rising up to you the second that you wear the banner of a movement that declared itself in Europe is ridiculous. Like, if you're scared of Western values staining your country, I am sure that the many people who are worried about it can figure out that saying that women shouldn't wear skirts is also a violation on modesty, even if they don't wear the same tag as Western feminists. So it's entirely unclear why the globalized aspect of this is what changes the perceptions that OG talks about. Now I want to talk about the way in which we have seen actual movements that fall into the globalist left arise. Because think about it, like, yes, Soros and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation are the institutional examples. But in recent years, this isn't the main form of leftist activity that's been happening globally. It's pro-Gaza protests that spread internationally through social media links that connect them across countries. It's things that pro-democracy protests that are also progressive in slant and are all youth influenced. It's the environmental wave that was probably the first beginning of organizations that cross countries, even if it's just in Europe or even if it's just in Africa, that synergize those protests. And what's important to notice is that the international leftists that decide, I want to join this branch of the Swedish girl that I've never heard before and that doesn't speak my language, or I want to join the protests that were held in a city that's far from me, is only when there is an acute enough situation that's pointed out in these localities that causes you to want to join this organization. Best example here is BLM. What happened is that Minnesota or more recently ICE's reactions in the United States are perceived as a state of emergency, one that leftists in Canada or in Europe are suddenly turning their eyes to because they say this is a severe enough instance. At that point, the globalist left isn't Soros giving money to some Jewish Illuminati. It's people who support or join the channel of the person in Minnesota that raised the alarm and said something that was so severe that we are suddenly all listening. Why is this important? Because it really influences the characterization of who are the people who rise to be the main spokespeople of these globalist trends. It's those that are most affected by police brutality, the family members of Breonna Taylor that have been on news consistently. It cannot be any other source because no other source ignited it, so no other source is trusted by the other global communities that join this struggle. Why is this characterization extremely important? The first thing that I want to point out is that it flips the opening government concern about whether the left focuses on the good or the peripheral and stupid parts of progressivism. And that is because local branches of progressivism in the West, which OG agrees are the biggest, are very, very stupid. They focus on peripheral issues because they're not bothered by deeper issues. So when they conceive of feminism, it is a question of microaggressions as opposed to looking at icons or central parts of the globalist left like Malala that can tell them that attacks on women is where they should be targeting or focusing their advocacy. So I think that the rise of people who are in the most affected context as part of the globalist left means that those people that have seen the worst that can happen within that type of struggle speak against or in favor of a concentrated support towards the things that matter most that they have themselves been exposed to at the expense of these small minutiae that the West currently engages in. But secondly, this also extends the capacity of the global left in a few key respects. The first is there is a critical mass that you need to reach as a progressive movement because, first burden, progressives have a really hard time of establishing themselves in getting institutional activities within their countries. First, they are largely concentrated in a generation that is very young, a generation that does not have a large enough of income or wealth in itself to sink, unlike, for example, philanthropists that could do many actions by just convincing a very small group. So it requires the consolidation of many people that donate $5 a month because that's all that they can spare out of their matcha coffee because they're not professionals yet, in order to actually achieve a significant enough fund or sum that you can then go and convince international organizations to support you, international or even governments. Yes, bottom half.
Why leftism always? Who knows? Maybe it's not the best.
So Lucy told me, oh, geez, gonna run left, small left better. So then we tell Alec, that means top half agrees left is good. I think this is a great strategy. The next reason that I want to give here is that there is much easier time concentrating at the same time over which issues are most important to you. The problem that happens with local leftist branches that OG discusses is that at every point in time, the progressives pick one of the 1,000 things that are bothering them. So in Arkansas, one of them is concerned about whether or not this space is inclusive enough for disabled people. And another one in another country is concerned about fresh water access. The benefit of having organizations that are concentrated, like Soros, like Melinda Gates, or like organizations that are cross-progressive, like Progressive International and IG, is that those organizations consolidate this umbrella of issues, which means they say, now we focus on this. We focus on solving water access. We focus on getting greater access to female hygiene. And that means that then there isn't a disparate amount of focus on these things. There's enough people to repost them so others notice. Enough money to be sunk into this year and concentrated into this time. Oh.
I would like to thank the speaker for that speech and call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue that debate. Thank you.
I want to start with the very uncharitable response that we got at the top of Amitai's speech, because it isn't just within like very regressive countries that this is applied. It's within many different countries, and Shane's case does apply in those countries, because it is just an empirical fact that the majority of the working class feel betrayed by the left. They feel betrayed by the people that were supposed to represent them. We think that this was because of the globalized left. We think that we empower them and ensure that the rise of the right wing, which has harmed both them and their countries and the legacy of their countries to a huge degree. What I'm going to do is firstly respond to what we heard from the leader of the opposition, and then I'm going to talk more broadly about the impacts that you're able to guarantee on opening government. First then, I think what's important to note is that the sort of policy that they necessarily talk about, or the types of people that they talk about, probably would have arisen anyway and gained power anyway due to things such as social media, which is symmetric. What that means is that the type of influence they have would have accrued, and they likely would have influenced how it is that politicians operate. What this debate is more specifically about is the interconnection between lobby groups, NGOs, and politicians across borders, because when those interact, they tend to aim for similar policies, which then push for certain things. The issue here is that, yes, while they do listen to advocacy sometimes, the majority of the reason as to why they listen is because they are guaranteed a load of money and guaranteed the backing of large businesses in return for pursuing policies that are beneficial to them, or they're trying to seek the vote of people who are more middle class and people who are trying to necessarily move, who are socially progressive, even if they necessarily aren't particularly economically progressive or economically left-wing. What this means is that they shift their policies in a way that isn't going to be beneficial for the working class. And I'm going to talk about that previously. So I think the main issue with opening opposition is that their conception of the debate is just incorrect. I think the second response then is they say that the West is necessarily stupid, but then they stand over the types of good policies that the West would be pushing for, such as the BLM movement, etc. If it is true that the West is stupid, then why is it the case that they're pushing for those beneficial policies that they outlined? Why is it that they're pushing for these good causes? I'm unsure. If they're stupid, they're probably going to be pushing for harmful policies. But now let's talk about Shane's case, because I think that this is debate winning. Firstly, on the narrative that the working class have been abandoned, and this has been fueled by it. The first thing is that the working class did not have a voice in shaping the policy that we're necessarily talking about, particularly in between countries and across lines. It was likely academics who were paid in order to get their opinions. It was likely, and who don't have the same lived experiences as those who are working class, because they simply are able to do research and create policies based on that research, as instead of applying what it is that people who were living within those circumstances and have those experiences actually have. It was interest groups who represented minorities and who were given a platform and then listened to in relation to the types of policies that ought to be promoted. And unions, which have been weakened over a long period of time due to the encroachment of corporate power and due to issues such as this, we're not given the same ability to have actual policy engagement, and therefore the representation of the workers and the people who predominantly would have been involved with left-wing policy in the past weren't adequately represented. The second thing in relation to this globalization is that it feels so far out of reach for the majority of people who live on the ground and live in poverty within nations. When you think of countries such as the UK, which does actually have quite a large degree of poverty within it, a lot of the people there feel out of reach from things such as the European Union, and that is why they pushed back against being a member of the European Union, because they felt ruled by it and as though they weren't being listened to in their own country. You have elitist people and who are seen as elitist because they are highly educated and they have money that people can never dream of having, making decisions about what policy their parties that are supposed to represent them have. You have the accents of the people who are talking about the policies and talking about your experiences being from the posh part of Dublin. They all sound like Jack Palmer. What this means is that they just feel incredibly detached from this. They feel detached. They sound like me too, if fair. They feel incredibly detached. This makes people really easy to manipulate because right-wing people who are extremely right-wing are able to weaponize this incredibly effectively through the fear of the types of policies that they are trying to promote, such as allowing migration into people's country and saying that this is how you are necessarily going to lose your job, the job that is the only thing that is keeping the roof above your head and putting food on the table for your family. It is saying that the engagements with the problems and the framing of the problems is one that is always done through the lens of the left having failed you and the left no longer being willing to serve you because they are more willing to serve the donors that they said they weren't going to listen to. I think what this leads to is a couple of things in a moment, Jack. Firstly, it means that you vote for policies that are necessarily going to be harmful for them because they are promised that they are going to be served by negating the types of policies that the left has necessarily engaged with, but the right-wing policies are always going to serve the interests of those corporations that hold power over them through things such as bad contracts and employment and power over a large amount of wealth. Second thing is you separate and divide the working class politically because some working class people may remain leftist and some working class people may move to the right, which means that those communities are then disrupted to a huge degree and means that people can't actually come to a consensus as to how it is that they're going to get some benefit for themselves. It leads to violence against the minorities that they think are taking away their political will and taking away their ability to have a job and to engage. We see this in countries where the rise of the right has happened, in places like Italy, literally in places like Ireland, where people blame their poverty on those who are also weak. It also alienates them from all of the left because they associate everything that is happening with the left as opposed to just this one particular party. I'll take you.
Shane Tully tells me that the globalist left is far too extreme and they're way too progressive. Rob Fitzpatrick tells me that they're centrist. Which one of you is lying?
No, because they're extreme in the socially progressive views, which necessarily are viewed as extreme to individuals on the ground who otherwise would have been served by economically left policies previously. Jack just doesn't understand how to listen, I guess. What this means necessarily is that you just have a less ability for the rise of the far right, as characterised by Shane. You have more engagement on the ground, and we see this with things such as the Labour Party in the UK losing a huge amount of support and no longer having the working class on their back. The only thing that can counter it is a focus on that working class. On weighing, I think that firstly, in the long term, this shifts the entire political landscape, which is incredibly, very hard to reverse, and therefore limits the ability to actually make policy into the future that is going to be stable and allow people to live their lives. On intensity, the policy is worse, which therefore means people have just worse quality of lives, and the type of hatred that is induced among the people is one that is very generational and very difficult to get out of and entrenched. We have certainty and the quickness, because now policies don't actually have to be discussed amongst these groups in order to happen. You're able to focus locally on the policies that necessarily matter to you and that the unions are talking about. I think that this is going to be my last ever BP speech. I'm really happy that I got to do it with Shane, and I'm really glad that I got to do it against the Jacks.
And call upon the deputy leader of the opposition to finish us off after this debate here.
That's this way, okay. Cool. Ready? I'm going to talk about two things. First, I'm going to talk about buy-in and what kind of things is being pushed according to Open Gov. Second, I'm going to talk about why this is necessary for lots of the movements, NGOs, and political parties to rise in the first place. I want to start with the buy-in. So the opening government claim here is that richer countries or richer NGOs, richer movements are going to be pushing for policies that are not tied to the needs of the other countries, and that's going to create lots of backlash. This is just insanely counterintuitive, right? Why would this be in the interest of the richer countries? At best, they say, like, sometimes you have egos. The issue is, I think, in many cases, you are quite pragmatic. If you have a partner NGO or a partner political party in a different country, presumably the way that you benefit from the collaboration with them the most is by having them have power and influence and or getting more money if it's an NGO. In that case, you probably know that if you're pushing for things that's going to make them less elected, if opening government could figure it out in 14 minutes, then probably everyone else can figure out that if you're pushing for things that everyone hates, you're not going to get elected, and you're losing that kind of collaborator. So that explains that you probably don't have that incentive. Secondly, it is much easier to adapt to have the other parties or the partner NGO or partner movement adapt to the context of the specific country which they're operating. Precisely because, like, you want to have buy-in into that policy, you don't want to be wasting money if you are donating something. Then you want to make that you want to consult them and have them prepare what they actually how they want to adapt to the kinds of things that you are pushing for. Second, like, you often are aware that you don't have the knowledge of the context, knowledge of the language. All of those kinds of things are necessary to have the proper collaboration with whoever you are collaborating with. It's also just much more efficient than trying to, like, draft things that you then impose onto someone else. The final thing they say is, but you might, like, put conditions on the funding, and that's going to be really bad. Again, I think per the incentives that I just described later, the conditions are probably not going to be that bad. Obviously, you sometimes put conditions on things like donations that you are giving, but they tend to be quite good ones, right? Like things like transparency, for example. And if you have a relatively nascent political party or a nascent movement or any organization that doesn't have the trust, the fact that you get something that is conditional, you have to do transparency, that provides you a big source of legitimacy for, say, getting future funding, or for like how the government within your country perceives you and how much they are willing to crack down against you if they know that there is a funding that came that had the conditions. So all of this suggests that probably the buy-in is not going to be a problem. Amitai also explained that it's much more likely that the issues that affect people the most intensely are the ones that have become at the forefront. So all of that, I think, deals with that claim. The next, what do you have?
Under the guise of liberating the women of Iraq, every single Democrat except one voted for the beginning of the war in 2002. Do you think the women in Iraq have been liberated?
You know what, I think I'm actually going to address it here, which is the comparative is worse exactly in the sense that Alec is describing, right? So if you have isolated per openings government, you have left-wing parties that exist in different countries. There's going to be a left-wing party in rich countries like in the US still. The issue is that on their side, they're not coordinating. They don't have a trusted network of partners in Iraq, I guess, or anywhere else. But you still do foreign policy, right? Like, you're still a political party that is doing foreign policy. The question is, how do you decide the foreign policy? On our side, you have a global network. So you discuss, you collaborate, you think, you consult, right? So in that case, you probably would do it better. On their side, you do it unilaterally, in which case you do it worse. Maybe this example, like, there are other incentives why you did that, but like in cases where it makes a difference, I think on the margin it's much better on our side. So this second thing I just want to observe here is that, as we said, in many cases, movements that are doing progressive things, or anyone who's suggesting progressive things, are labeled as Western anyway, because just like generally like progressive ideas and going against the tradition of your culture, this just tends to be associated with the West, even if the West is not involved at all. So in many cases, if this backlash occurs just from that, it occurs regardless, but you don't get any of the benefits that we are talking about in terms of money, knowledge, and stuff like that. So the next thing I want to talk about is why then it is actually necessary. Because opening government says, but like all of those things would just have, the separate local things would have risen anyway, because of apparently social media. So I just want to note, like, social media is endogenous to this debate, right? The Infoslide describes movements, for example, such as the BLM, and Amita already explained how social media was used to get the transnational rise of that. But next, like, yes, you can theoretically, maybe by some chance, rise on social media, but I think, like, it's much less likely than if you are able to have a network that is backing you with being able to pay for advertisements, already resharing the content that you are having, commenting on those kinds of things. Probably on the margin of where it's more likely to happen, on our side is much, much, much higher than on theirs. The next thing I want to say, that you often might not have the money, even if you do have existing support within your country. So for example, if you're in a country that is like quite low income and you are representing the interests of those people, then as an NGO locally, you might not have sufficient number of donors that are actually able to donate to you, even if they want you to represent them. Or like not many people who can donate grassroots campaigns to the left political party within your country. That is exactly where the transnational network can step in, provide you the extra money so that you are able to actually represent what the support that you already have in your support that the issues already have in your country have. The next thing to observe here is that, like, in many cases you have to go against I guess like things that already have established international networks on their own, right? So for example, if you are litigating against like corporations are already multinational, right? They have the ability to cross-subsidize and send money and use them whichever country they need to do it. So the fact that now you have the same option where you're also able to pour money into where it's needed is incredibly, incredibly important. So the final thing to say is that institutional knowledge is also a significant barrier. If you are a nascent movement or nascent political party or organization anyway, you often just do not have the knowledge of how you are meant to be approaching things, right? Like, you might have the understanding of how to fight the legal battles. You don't have some understanding of how to organize your protest movement. Again, I think that the knowledge is transferred such that it is adapted to your particular context, but it's a really important thing that you get the knowledge in the first place, and then you can adapt it. On their side, you need to be figuring everything out from the start. Because of that, this is just a good thing.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech and call upon the member of government to continue this debate. Here.
Do I need the mic? Yeah, definitely? Yeah. Okay, fine. Yeah. The globalist left is a front for a group of financiers, pundits, and mostly pedophiles who started the war in Iraq and spread the culture war to many, many places, including, apparently, Bulgaria. The first thing I want to do in this speech is to explain why the globalist left is, for a long time has been, a front for generally corporations and nefarious interest groups to push their interests. Notice that even if this started as something that was just for the interest of progressive politics, doesn't mean it always was, and doesn't mean it has to remain that way. The first, I would just want to very briefly explain why these companies and actors have an incentive to just become involved and highly involved and just in this spider web of the globalist left. The first reason, and just you need to understand the power that this globalist left wields in terms of the media that it controls. Like CNN, by the way, every country has CNN Greece, CNN Bulgaria, CNN whatever, which is a major news source. Bloomberg, foreign policy advisors who sit in on the actual war room and at the table and genuinely whisper into the ear of the person making decisions, the political parties that are funded, and therefore the agendas that they pursue. Therefore, there's a strong incentive for companies to become involved because they want favorable economic policy, which is why the globalist left pushes for things like economic liberalization and opening trade. Also, they want to change politics by having things like less financial regulation. Notice that like companies like Halliburton were built, no thank you, were built on the wars in the Middle East and the oil that they were able to extract. So if they were able to achieve these policy objectives through the globalist left, that would be very good for them. Why do they have the capacity to infiltrate the globalist left? No. Firstly, they go to the same galas and social circles. They all went to Epstein's Island. Guys, the Clintons, Noam Chomsky is there with all the corporate executives. This sounds, okay, guys, like obviously this is kind of funny because it's a conspiracy theory and stuff, like, but it's not actually really a conspiracy theory. They did go. And you may think, oh, guys, no, social stuff, but it doesn't really matter because the structural incentives, these are people. Ultimately, like, if you're able to go to Epstein's Island and converse with Bill Clinton and persuade him of an idea, he's a person. He's going to act on that. Social circles that these people go to matter hugely. But secondly, let's talk structural incentives. No, the globalist left needs capital to deploy for their ads, etc. Where do you think they get this? Obviously, it's from companies that want to do things like whitewash, that want to have a say in what is pushed in the agendas, and therefore very much willing to supply this capital. Also, this isn't just other companies, it's the media companies. How do you think you're able to push for progressive politics in other countries? It's by actually talking to the people who interview people in those countries, talking to the media stations in those countries. And so those media stations like Michael Bloomberg and so on gets a stake, gets a say at the table. No, thank you. And lastly, I just want to say it's impossible to keep this to account. Why? Because the social aspect is obviously very difficult to keep to account. You don't know exactly who these people hang around with, etc. We only found out about part of the Epstein stuff a very long time after. So it's really difficult to keep this stuff accountable. But moreover, even in terms of the funding stuff, obviously when it's some no thank you, money coming from like a private account in the Cayman Islands and going abroad in a wire transfer, that's obviously going to be hard for you to audit and track. And so generally speaking, a lot of this happens unaccountably. By the way, it's not even illegal, so I don't know why you would have to track it. Ultimately, I think on this own, this contribution wins us the debate. Why? Because this gives them massive power. They're able to set agendas at like the World Economic Forum. They're able to determine the focus of parties. On this own, this flips opening opposition because it explains why the policies that will be pursued are not the like cuddly progressive policies, but in many cases will be malicious. But let's be specific. No. Let's be specific. No. Let's be specific about the ways in which it was malicious. Firstly, let's talk about foreign interventions. Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, what have you. Okay. Is this high burden, guys? Maybe. But the first reason as to why this, the rise of the globalist left largely contributed to these is because of what I explained in terms of the corporate interests who I've explained largely control or have significant influence within the globalist left, having an incentive to engage in these wars, right? Like Halliburton, as I explained, Standard Oil, etc., were created through these kinds of wars. Why can't they do otherwise? Why can't they just lobby by default? And this is important, right? I assume that's what they're going to say. It's because they don't get access to the huge network effects that the globalist left provides. They don't get access to the foreign policy advisors who actually sit in on the table. At best, they can do things like fund campaigns. But maybe you don't find this persuasive. And here's the second reason. Is because you can make these wars ideologically motivated. Halliburton on its own maybe can fund the politician, maybe can change the politician's mind. Can it run a campaign that effectively changes the minds of many millions of voters? No. Who can? Michael Bloomberg and the globalist left. CNN can. They can say that we're going in to free women, to spread democracy, and give supplementary reasons to just the war and terrorism. This is why Tony Blair's Labour government, all the Democrats but one, all voted for the Iraq war. But panel, why is this the tipping point? Because it persuades those who would otherwise oppose it. Maybe you think the Republicans are all evil and would have gone in anyways. And maybe that's true. No, thank you. But the people who would oppose it, the left, the Democrats, Labour, and so on, those people now become persuaded by these justifications, which is important because for most of these wars, and yes, I know Trump is doing a kind of illegal war, but for these wars in the past, you needed two-thirds approval in Congress to go in. So this matters and this actually changes things. What's the impact of this argument, guys? 500,000 civilians died in Iraq. Many more soldiers were killed. Libya is still a failed state with an ongoing civil war. Afghanistan was seized by the Taliban. If you think there's even a 50% chance that even one of these conflicts is caused by the rise of the globalist left, you automatically vote closing government. Yes?
But that also happens with the globalist right and the globalist Christian and the globalist Epstein Club.
Guys. There is no, what is this globalist right? I don't know what this is. No, guys. No, okay, maybe it's like what, Turning Point USA, and they're kind of starting now. But guys, this hasn't been around for that long, and they don't have the same kind of influence. Maybe you want to argue that in the absence of the rise of the globalist left, they wanted to pursue the globalist right. Maybe didn't prove that. I think it's quite odd to say. Lastly, I want to talk about why this fuels and starts the culture war in various countries and why that's extremely destabilizing. Why does the globalist left fuel the culture wars in many places? The first reason is because they fund parties and media for the specific purpose of pushing progressive policies, even in countries that are generally conservative and wouldn't otherwise talk about those things. Like the America Foundation for Bulgaria specifically does this, for example. Secondly, notice that the interest of the corporate actors and backers that I've explained is to push for the culture war because it distracts from economic policy and allows the politicians to pass things like lower taxation while everyone is freaking out over the culture war around trans people and so on. But the last thing to note is in terms of why the right gets more ammunition, because they can now, and I guess this is briefly mentioned, but the right gets more ammunition because they can now label the left as being foreign pushed and stuff. And this is important because it feeds into the culture war and makes it even more potent. Why is this bad? Ultimately because it polarizes society. The culture wars hit far closer to home than any other issue, right? You can say the other person is trying to make my country poorer, but when you say something like he's making my kids gay, that hits far closer to home and makes people feel afraid, and therefore the right gets to polarize people far, far more. For all of these reasons, guys, this is a bad idea.
Hello? Okay. Ooh, this is weird. No. Panel, good. Two extensions from closing opposition. One, these left-wing parties are now in power and can implement their policies, which is way bigger than the top half. And secondly, on funding, which I don't know why OO didn't run. 5 responses to closing government. Firstly, they influence policies on both sides because they want to influence both left and right-wing individuals because at different points those people may be in power. 2, they often compete for those influences and they often undercut each other if the other is bad and if they act bad. So there's often self-correcting mechanisms. It is why neither ideological person wants to always go to fucking war. Dick Cheney wasn't a liberal. Thirdly, the rich know each other. They exist in the same social circles. But that is true of the left and the right. The fourth is the laws to minimize over-influence. You do not want some rogue actor entering your country and starting a conflict just for the crack of it. The last thing that I would say here is it's not clear why you need the global left for this. There is the military lobby that actively profits from an ongoing conflict. It is the body bag effect when you see individuals literally the victims of terrorist attacks or your soldiers coming home dead. That influences the public. That influences you, whether you're left or right wing. And sometimes those conflicts are justified. They needed to prove where the line was necessary in order to stop this. But often the left-wing parties are anti-war. They are often campaigning for rights and protections when the US comes in and tries to bomb particular countries, because the US being left-wing is not the only form of left-wing policy and the only one that is unique to that. It needed to be more comparative. Firstly, on funding. Why do you get so much money? There's billionaires like the Gates Foundation that actively wants to fund a lot of projects and distribute this money there. Secondly, there are left-wing governments that want to give developmental aid that have access to budgets that are often billions or trillions of dollars. The third is there's international donations from countries globally, from the richest to the poorest, who often want to benefit from this, so give money. There are limited conditions imposed upon this. The conditions are often simple. Anti-corruption measures to ensure the money goes to the right people, the ways in which it was ensured there was trust on it. The second is you want to encourage local left-wing parties rather than impose the ideological preferences of, say, a large, wealthy Western country, as opening government tried to say you would for no reason. The implications of this are pretty simple. You distribute the funds via NGOs, and this looks like campaigns, charities, malaria nets being given out as a campaign to protect and save literal lives on the ground, healthcare to ensure that people do not die. It is abuse shelters to ensure that women who are the victims of domestic violence are able to be protected. It is legal protections if you are a minority to be able to defend yourself when you are brought to court. It is spread via these NGOs because they have the capacity. I'm going to weigh this in a couple of ways. The first is on the left-wing and right wing. Just take the money. It's not turn gay for resources. If you're right wing, you can show up and take the money and benefit from it. There's no fucking trade-off. The second is the rich people are fine with giving this money away, but specifically utilize the global left as the donors to have a large image, but secondarily are able to share the costs of starting these policies and able to share it cross-border. The third is just take the right-wing rich money too. Elon Musk, etc., that specifically want to do this. Companies have incentives to get involved on this, so you're likely to see this spread out. And I want to just scale this. These types of policies that help you, for example, with protections to stop the spreading of AIDS, to ensure that malaria nets are saved, literally saves hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives. This isn't just like tomorrow. These are policies that are implemented for an entire lifetime. 50, 100 years of these policies are very difficult to take back, and maybe that saves individuals' lives. Second argument, before I go on, opening.
Yeah, the issue here is the money puts your face in the billboard, but if people believe the billboard was bought with money you're using to push agenda they disagree with and take away what they believe in, it means you don't get the legislation you need, and you also put those people in harm's way of radicals.
Okay, but people have the association that you do good things. If someone saves my life, I'm not going to go, inside trading, random thoughts. Like, I just don't get why you suddenly hate Bill Gates so much. I think, I don't know. Second argument, rise in the left wing. You campaign for each other. You go and help each other cross country. You campaign at those elections. You help those individuals out. The second is you share political strategies that maybe worked in your country to see if the underlying conditions are similar in terms of campaigning to ensure that you can get more votes. The third is that there's resource sharing. That is to say that if you have money that you can donate to the other party in a different country, so maybe if the left-wing party isn't as funded, but also just point out that closing government do a lot of this analysis for us by indicating that you are likely to have a high degree of influence. So I'm willing to agree with this. The second is you get made stronger because you have more votes due to the prior mechs, including therefore improving your influence and therefore leading to more seats and more influence in the parliament. Left-wing parties often have these resources for the mechanisms I gave in the first argument. But the third is now you have a greater capacity. You can compete with existing right-wing parties that may be more entrenched, that maybe have the mechanisms from right-wing parties that do so. But now you have left-wing governments in power. And I want to illustrate this in three ways. The first is there's just a number of left-wing parties globally in power. It is factually true. Labour in the UK, for example. And these individual countries specifically have voters because they care about rights, they care about the quality of life, and that is why they often vote for them. But then secondly, there's a shift from minority to majority. That is to say that maybe if you were 5 seats short in one election, the influence of the globalist left has been the tipping point for you able to get into power. But the third is that maybe if you're a smaller party, you still have the capacity to become a kingmaker, which gives you the coalition to be able to acquire. Now, closing government go, the left wing just love war. But that's not really left wing ideology. That's not really a right wing ideology either. Now, some of the times they're more captured by the military lobby. But what does left wing policy on a day-to-day basis for the average country actually look like? It looks like workers' protections to ensure that you do not have to go into a coal mine and die due to lung cancer. It looks like welfare that specifically is relative to the country and therefore is economically cost efficient, but not too expensive to ensure that people do not starve on the streets or your country does not have high poverty rates. The third is social protection. Laws that protect minorities, or secondarily, avoid democratic backsliding because you do not want your country to necessarily be overtaken by a too right-wing influence or a too left-wing influence, so you often moderate. But it's also the reasons that GovBench give. You're not a moron. You specifically are not idiots. You want to be re-elected and specifically are likely to do competent things, hire competent people. You've learned from your mistakes and get advice from other individual governments that maybe have been advised in the past of what was the bad implementation of left-wing policies. And it's often hard to take these policies back because over years people get used to these policies and realize that they were being over dramatic, being exaggerated, how afraid they were of it. They become used to it, so psychologically it's not as much of a voting issue. The second is it's subtle law changes that you don't need to go, we've suddenly radically changed everything, but you just change it in parliament and most people do not consume this information and do not know. The third is you just want to co-opt these votes and therefore specifically these parties also shift there. The weighing here is simple. It's certainty. These governments have implemented these policies. They can implement them tomorrow. They are in government. You do not actually speculate that maybe on the ground things will change. The second is the scale. It affects the entire population of a country, maybe more so than even local types of policy changes. The third is that you can access greater funds to scale all of the other things that I talk about. Because it's not just that you are solely reliant on the external factors, but rather the fact that when you are in government, when you have a government budget, you can allocate this as you see fit. Because we are the team that does this debate correctly. Closing opposition.
I would say many things I will say in this speech will sound straight up Alex Jones direct translation. I stand by everything. I completely believe this. I just want there to be no confusion. Look, I get it. Obama's a nice guy. He has a smooth jump shot. He's charismatic. The man has murdered more than any modern president. The Democratic Party is the most warmongering party in the entire world. Clinton went into fucking Kosovo. All of these people went into that shit. What are we doing? And all of the, the modern left are the ones doing it, not anyone else. Firstly, 5 responses to what closing government has said to us regarding their 5 responses. And unlike Jack, mine won't be 1 sentence and 3 words each in this particular capacity. First response, why? Because one of these responses are, why is this unique? Why is this necessary for the global left to do it? Why can't any other political function do it? The first is, know that why is there a political function in the first place necessary? The first reason is because this allows justifications of what would otherwise not be political actions, to justify things such as removing taxes under the guise of it being progressive, under the guise of this particular case. This can take place in 2 ways. The first is, this can take place in the country where you are going, where people wouldn't care about, like, for example, oh, I represent certain company, but they would care if you say this is a sign of progress, this is a sign of Westernism and of leftism in this particular case. If this is effective per all their analysis, this happens. But secondly, this also changes politics within rich countries themselves too. Why? Because when there is a global left, there's also a cultural shift that you ought to care more about leftist issues elsewhere across the globe. This is a thing you are engaged with, a thing you ought to engage with in this particular capacity. But also many of these global leftists share these kinds of, oh, look, there are terrible stories of like women being oppressed in a variety of places, blah, 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 blah. They often showcase them. But the problem is your response to this is to go to war, because that is what these companies want. They don't push it to you because they want you to donate to women. They push it to you because they want the politician they fund to go like, let's go and shoot some fuckers until the women can do whatever they want. Second response. This is one, by the way. Compare this, Jack. I advise you. Second response. Know that it is vastly easier to convince people to donate if there is a political basis rather than just an obvious lobbying one. Here's the problem. Many people who donate want these nefarious things, but many people who donate to these kind of groups are not nefarious. They don't know that their money is being misused in this kind of sense. They don't know that that's what their money is being pushed to vote for. It's almost impossible to keep account for it. And when there's a political promise, you convince regular leftist people to give their money towards lobbying for like corporate things, lobbying for more war, lobbying for all of these particular things. Thirdly, why does it need to be particularly the left to do this? Why can't it be other kinds of justifications like there are terrorists, let's go to war, or the global right, if such exists? The first is, note that the global left is actually very uniquely effective for many people. Many people engage with the left in a very particular sense, even in the West, right? Because most people in the West still support things like gay rights, still support things like women's rights in one regard or another in this particular capacity. So it's very often relatively convincing, and it's more convincing than other justifications. Because things like, oh, Afghanistan may have a nuke and they may nuke you. These are some hypotheticals that may have happened, may not have happened, but the women in Afghanistan are suffering today. The women in Afghanistan today don't have rights is much more influential upon you in this particular case. But also the second reason beyond reason beyond this, why is this unique to the global left and not to the global right? So why is there no global right, right? Such a thing does not exist factually, but why? What's the structural reason? Because there is no such thing, bro. Compared to the global left, fucking George Soros, show me right-wing George Soros, Elon Musk, go.
Elon Musk.
Yeah, okay. No. Your claps are appreciated, though you lack knowledge. That is okay. These people are not only very new, and for the vast majority of the last 20 or so years, not a major factor, but these people donate internally, not externally. They don't donate for things happening in other places. They don't donate for things occurring in this regard. Why? Because most of the world is more right-wing than America. Most of the world is more right-wing in this particular case. There's no necessity for rich people there to vote for this particular thing because they're already right-wing. Oh, we need the religious, people to be religious. Go to Afghanistan, man. Why do you need to send the global right to fucking Afghanistan? Whereas the global left, most of the world is less right-wing than the US. Most of it is more left-wing in this particular case. So the necessity for this exists vastly more. But finally, let's say that the global right still exists. Let's say that all of these kind of things still happen. This convinces the rightoids. But you need to convince the leftoids often too. Many governments, they say governments are sometimes left, sometimes right. Yeah, very often they are left-wing. But also very often you need supermajority to pass certain constitutional policies. You need substantial support for this to happen. This can help you convince people who aren't right-wing, who would only be convinced by left-wing things, who can only be created in this particular case when you have a global left-wing lobbying group. I want to say two responses to the funding thing on malaria nets and everything. The first is, charity is not in this debate. Charity can exist regardless without there being a globalist left-wing policy. But I'll go further. I think there's just less charity funding at the point where there's this particular thing, where there are these kinds of political funding. Why? Because it gets co-opted for political purposes in this particular case. There are always incentives to donate. Rich people may want to give money. You want to do a tax write-off in this particular capacity. Now you can do a tax write-off that benefits you. Now you can do a tax write-off towards a PAC that says help leftists in whatever, that actually wants to lower taxes. So this leads to less money going to real charitable contributions because they have an incentive to do political contributions instead because they also benefit them. You should be writing this down, Alex. Don't worry. Why is this more important than the clash on whether we get more leftism or not? The first is, the right and whether the left is good, who knows, right? This is for people above us to decide. But the left and the right actually agree on a variety of issues, on whether it being good for the government to work, whether it being good to have trust in systems so you interact with the police. When there's more polarization, when people distrust each other more, when they don't vote together because parties teach them to hate each other, then you may lose out on some potentially progressive policies, but you lose out on every other policy that's also beneficial in this particular case. But secondly, this leftism can be sometimes good, sometimes bad. But many of the incentives we talk about are always bad. They're in the interest of enriching people that are already rich. They're in the interest of creating terrible things in this particular capacity. But thirdly, note that leftism can coexist together and support each other regardless through unstructured manner, through social media, through interactions in this particular case. We tell you through structured ways, who the money goes to, where the money is sent, and what does this influence. But fourthly and finally, note that this is most important because it doesn't just affect political policy, but affects economic policy, every other policy. Follow us.
Let's begin with Alec Jones and Taller Nick Fuentes in closing government. I have 7 responses here. The first is that the right are also nonces. Allegedly. But the crucial difference is, sure, maybe left-wing policy wasn't great because of this. Maybe globalism as a whole thing, which is what they're really arguing against, can be bad sometimes. The thing is that we gave the capacity for the left wing to win elections, which is to say, people voted for this. It's what they wanted. So they got tax cuts to the rich, but also tax cuts to the lower middle class and other instances. Also more welfare, all the impacts that Jack talked to you about. So sure, maybe Bill Clinton's a nonce, so is Trump. The fact is that we got votes for Obama, sure, but also separately for Biden, and more crucially for people elsewhere in countries that are more important that I can't name, but they exist, trust me. The second thing is that ultimately, if the left have no power based on this as a corollary, the war still occurs, right? Because they want to say, it was the leftoids not showing a significant pushback against war that enabled it to happen. But if the left is doing dog shit in elections because it can't win, because it can't mobilize, doesn't have access to the resources that Jack talked to you about, then it won't have a significant block to be able to go against the war regardless, which is to say this makes their case somewhat non-comparative, which isn't ideal. The third thing is that ultimately targeted lobbying would have occurred regardless, right? If it is the case that corporations really wanted that oil, they ultimately would have just gone individually to Tony Blair, individually to Obama, individually to George Bush, who actually was at the time as well. So they just do this all individually, and they have the capacity to do so per your own analysis in closing government. The fourth thing is that ultimately, I know CG are young, and I was only a few months old at the time, but I'll never forget the day where I was the day the towers fell, which is to say, the reason why the left all voted to go in on the war on terror in the US was because, like, 9/11, that they had to. If you didn't do that, you would have lost your political career overnight. This is obviously not what happened. Separate, fifth mechanism, Article 5, which is to say the reason why other people joined them in Afghanistan is because they had to under NATO. It wasn't necessarily linking of NGOs telling them to go in. It was literally a multinational organization. The sixth thing is intervention hype. Tony Blair didn't just want little Tony Blairs running around Kosovo. He wanted them in Afghanistan. He wanted them everywhere. He wanted Tony Blairs to take over the world. The fact is at the time when the left went in on these interventions or were not opposing them, it was kind of like the done thing. It was seen as they were able to stop some humanitarian abuses in one place. Let's try to do that in more instances. I don't know why these NGOs needed to be involved for that to be the case. And the seventh thing, and this is most crucial, is that this is just no longer true, right? Because think about the global left now and their foreign policy statements as they're coordinated. It is Spain, it is Ireland, it is Norway, who are not saying we need more intervention. They're saying end wars. They're saying end the conflict right currently in southern Lebanon, no war with Iran. That is what is happening right now from the global left. So just empirically, this argument is outdated. And given I gave historical analysis on the outdated stuff to show it's not comparative, I think that analysis is out of the debate. Before I move on to opening government, yeah, Shane, take it away. Well, here.
Money doesn't buy votes. Per our analysis, it just makes people more distrustful and empowers the right in persecuting you, which happens irrespective of the clash on good policy. You lose people the legislation they rely on. You empower the far right, which is how you actually get more wars.
So would you believe I'm now going to engage with opening government? On the westernization or corporatization of local left-wing policies, this also engages with the culture war stuff coming from closing government. This time I only have 4 responses, but I swear they're good. The first is that this didn't happen like George Soros walked in and was like, I'm making a political party in Albania. George Soros had to go to a pre-existing party with a set identity, with a on-the-ground reputation. And you can't then overnight change your policies. You can't shift massively to what is not actually representative of local issues on the ground. So because you had to coordinate with pre-existing parties, with pre-existing identities, the capacity for large change away from local policy, away from local sentiment, is obviously just massively reduced. The second thing is we actually get better policy, both in terms of efficacy and palatability, because of the access to experts. Because ultimately, literally yesterday, we've all benefited from George Soros. If any of you looked on the wall yesterday, where we were was a building that was founded, the Central European University, founded by George Soros. Because ultimately, what you also get is through NGOs that are funded, access to research. And this is important because especially in countries where you maybe don't have the same degree of academia built up over time, ultimately, what you then get is access to economists to be able to study your economic problems, not just the economic problems in the UK or the US. So you now get access to the knowledge you need to make good policy locally that will actually be well designed. But also separately, NGOs love polling. They love palatability. They love going into this stuff so you can also then see through increased information and awareness what policies are likely to get you elected, which is your obvious incentive. The third thing is just like, you don't announce this, right? You don't go like, I'm here standing for election. I'd like to thank my daddy, George. He gave me all this money. It's in the back pocket. I think that's obviously not how you go about this, right? It's relatively hidden. People only know George Soros because of conspiracy lunatics like Mr. Alec over there and like huge fronting of it and like demonization of it. But even so, then most people don't realize that might be happening in their own country, which is the same extent as you may not have realized the building we were in yesterday was because of him. The fourth thing is just the globalist left isn't extreme. And look, Rob is right. I knew he was going to give the good POI answer that, yeah, it's like economically centrist, progressive, socially very progressive, sure, maybe. The problem is this is no longer true either. Because one classic example of the globalist left and how it networks is the International Labour Conference, where Labour parties from the UK, Canada, Australia, Ireland, which is where it was founded, shout out, all meet together to coordinate on policy. But the fact is when you look at Labour, which is a large member of that in the UK right now, they are obviously reneging on a lot of progressive policies. They are being anti-immigrant in many ways, which shows that the globalist left has the capacity to moderate when it is likely to get them elected based on progressive social issues. Look, on my way here, I will say, I think maybe the counter trade-offs on better policy in certain instances might have flipped this. It's probably just mitigation, I'll be honest. However, Jack has a whole point on the likelihood of the left to get elected. So now this mitigated chance of harms, this mitigation to the reduced chance of election, sure, but ultimately we've proven a large increase in your chance to get elected in this place over opening government. On opening opposition, I do not think, though they are very good, that opening opposition read the Infoslide, because ultimately grassroots organization, leaderless, which is done like asynchronously, independently of each other, is not a political party or an NGO, which are formal organizations, right? And their own analysis and examples shows that this can happen anyway, and Rob correctly points out that they are symmetric because of it, because algorithms can just spread this stuff regardless. But they do have other stuff. They mentioned wells are built, but Jack explicitly scales this. And ultimately, separately, Lucy has proved the problem for why the left sometimes can't get elected, but what Jack does, he gives a myriad of reasons why they will be likely to, so he solves the problem that they merely identified. And that's probably good to do. Thank you.